Hello and welcome. Today we have with us Lawrence Liang, who is in the Alternative Law Forum and one of the major players in the Creative Commons issue in the country. Lawrence, good to have you with us.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Lawrence, explain to the audience, what does Creative Commons mean for the creative community? It's something which I'm sure people are not too familiar with.
For the longest time, creativity has always been, built on the assumption that there is a vast and a rich public domain that one can take from and build on. And that was the default rule. So in a way, you could say that, the public domain was the default and copyright was the exception. But over a period of time, and in the last 2 decades particularly, with the shift to the idea of the global, knowledge economy, etc., when all of a sudden the entire control over the copyright system has been taken over by corporations and by large owners of content, increasingly a number of people feel that copyright doesn't actually work to promote creativity any longer. But by virtue of the fact that it has become the default rule, it basically means that everything becomes a permission culture. So you cannot do anything without taking the permission of the owners of copyright. And the irony is that this happens in a moment when technologically it's actually possible to do things in a way that wasn't possible earlier. So the Creative Commons came as a kind of an attempt to redress this balance. Because if the copyright system is based on an idea of all rights reserved, the Creative Commons system is based on an idea of some rights reserved. Right? So it argues that there may be a number of creators who don't have a problem with particular kinds of usages of their work. For example, it could be a non-commercial usage, or they don't have a problem with some people remixing it, provided that what they create is also available for others, etc. So it basically creates a bundle that you can choose from and uses copyright law, but in a manner that actually attempts to promote creativity and attempts to promote the interests of users.
Essentially, it is in some form giving the ownership back to the original creators, as it were.
Absolutely.
And not to have the corporations really control everything as it does today.
Absolutely.
This would be what would be the substance of the Creative Commons. You've been working on this in India. Do you think there is any enforceability issue here, or do you think there is absolutely no problem with the legal status, as it were, of Creative Commons licenses?
So we were responsible for porting the license into the Indian context, which means making it compliant with the Indian Copyright Act. Now, since the copyright law in India has been substantially based on the UK copyright law, there aren't that many issues. There are issues of terminology. So, for example, we use the word adaptation and not derivative works. We use the phrase fair dealing and not fair use, which may have, a few consequences legally. But otherwise, in terms of the enforceability of the license, there's no problem whatsoever. Even assuming that there were a problem with the enforceability of the license, at the end of the day, if I'm the copyright owner, and if the license is invalid, it doesn't make me not the copyright owner. So you still have to come to me for other terms. Maybe these terms that I've set upon you through this license are invalid. But the fact remains that you still cannot do anything without my permission.
What are the major Creative Commons licenses which you think are important for both the creative community as well as the rest of the people?
Sure. There are basically around 5 to 6 different kinds of licenses. And you could see them on a spectrum. On the one hand, kind of, in a sense, the most open licenses. And on the other is the really kind of restrictive one. The most open license would be the attribution license, which says that provided you give me attribution, you can do whatever you want to with the work. You can modify it, you can make commercial use of the work, so you can do whatever you want. There may be some people, and this is particularly important for artists and creators, who may not have a problem with the circulation of the work, but may be uncomfortable with the work being, modified. So you have something called the non-derivative license, which basically means that you can, for example, reproduce the work and you can distribute the work, but you can't modify the work. Or you could have something which is again, very important for artists and creators, which is that you can do whatever you want, provided that it's non-commercial usages. And if you want to make commercial use of the work, you have to come back to me. And we've actually had a number of instances in India already, where people have licensed their photographs primarily for a non-commercial use, and has then been picked up by newspapers which have used it, and that would be a commercial use. And we've sent them legal notices and we've sent them letters to which they have replied and have kind of, either issued apologies or have made kind of statements attributing the author in the event that they hadn't attributed the author.
There's been a huge number of Creative Commons licenses now being claimed by various authors.
Yeah.
Do you see the numbers growing and the copyright sphere declining over time? Do you think that's a likely event?
I think it's inevitable. I think given the kind of digital turn and the large number of people who, in a sense, are born digital, and here we're talking about the next generation, they don't have the same approach, to the idea of restrictions on their ability to share that, let's say, earlier generations may have had. And I think that this kind of consciousness is seeping in a big way. And ironically, I would say that one must thank the copyright industry at some level, because the more militant they get and the more kind of enforcement, as it gets harsher and harsher, it's inevitable that people will turn into kind of a certain copyleft consciousness. There's an interesting case of a student who really wasn't much of an activist, but had set up a file sharing network in the US, and he was sued as one of those kind of exemplary cases, right? And the damages that were granted against him were in the tune of like some $1.2 million, while he had with him $150 in his bank account. The company was very happy to take the $150 as a symbolic punishment. They spent a lot more on the litigation. But that made him a copyright kind of activist. And now he's become rather militant in his kind of attempt to protect, digital freedoms, etc. And I think that that's going to happen in more countries as copyright enforcement becomes more draconian.
Thank you, Lawrence. That was very interesting, and we'll come back to you, I'm sure, with more issues of this kind. Thanks.
Thank you.